The Lives of the 12 Caesars. By Suetônio. Caius Julius Caesar. Part 2.
If you are returning to the Classic Masterworks channel, welcome back. If you are new, please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you will be made aware of our latest content. And now, on with the story.
It is said that he was tall, of a fair complexion, round-limbed, rather full-faced, with eyes black and piercing, and that he enjoyed excellent health, except towards the close of his life, when he was subject to sudden fainting fits, and disturbance in his sleep. He was likewise twice seized with the falling sickness while engaged in active service. He was so nice in the care of his person, that he not only kept the hair of his head closely cut and had his face smoothly shaved, but even caused the hair on other parts of the body to be plucked out by the roots, a practice for which some persons rallied him. His baldness gave him much uneasiness, having often found himself upon that account exposed to the gibes of his enemies. He therefore used to bring forward the hair from the crown of his head, and of all the honors conferred upon him by the Senate and people, there was none which he either accepted or used with greater pleasure, than the right of wearing constantly a laurel crown. It is said that he was particular in his dress. For he used the latus clavus with fringes about the wrists, and always had it girded about him, but rather loosely. This circumstance gave origin to the expression of Sylla, who often advised the nobles to beware of the ill-girt boy. He first inhabited a small house in the Suburra, but after his advancement to the pontificate, he occupied a palace belonging to the state in the Via Sacra. Many writers say that he liked his residence to be elegant, and his entertainments sumptuous, and that he entirely took down a villa near the Grove of Aricia, which he had built from the foundation and finished at a vast expense, because it did not exactly suit his taste, although he had at that time but slender means, and was in debt, and that he carried about in his expeditions tessellated and marble slabs for the floor of his tent. They likewise report that he invaded Britain in hopes of finding pearls, the size of which he would compare together, and ascertain the weight by poising them in his hand, that he would purchase, at any cost, gems, carved works, statues, and pictures, executed by the eminent masters of antiquity, and that he would give for young and handy slaves a price so extravagant, that he forbade its being entered in the diary of his expenses. We are also told, that in the provinces he constantly maintained 2 tables, one for the officers of the army, and the gentry of the country, and the other for Romans of the highest rank, and provincials of the first distinction. He was so very exact in the management of his domestic affairs, both little and great, that he once threw a baker into prison, for serving him with a finer sort of bread than his guests, and put to death a freedman, who was a particular favourite, for debauching the lady of a Roman knight, although no complaint had been made to him of the affair. The only stain upon his chastity was his having cohabited with Nicomedes, and that indeed stuck to him all the days of his life, and exposed him to much bitter raillery. I will not dwell upon those well-known verses of Calvus Licinius. Whate'er Bithynia and her lord possessed, her lord who Caesar in his lust caressed. I pass over the speeches of Dolabella, and Curio, the father, in which the former calls him the queen's rival, and the inner side of the royal couch, and the latter, the brothel of Nicomedes, and the Bithynian stew. I would likewise say nothing of the edicts of Bibulus, in which he proclaimed his colleague under the name of the Queen of Bithynia, adding, that he had formerly been in love with a king, but now coveted a kingdom. At which time, as Marcus Brutus relates, one Octavius, a man of a crazy brain, and therefore the more free in his raillery, after he had in a crowded assembly saluted Pompey by the title of king, addressed Caesar by that of queen. Caius Memmius likewise upbraided him with serving the king at table, among the rest of his catamites, in the presence of a large company, in which were some merchants from Rome, the names of whom he mentions. But Cicero was not content with writing in some of his letters, that he was conducted by the royal attendants into the king's bedchamber, lay upon a bed of gold with a covering of purple, and that the youthful bloom of this scion of Venus had been tainted in Bithynia, but upon Caesar's pleading the cause of Nysa, the daughter of Nicomedes before the Senate, and recounting the king's kindnesses to him, replied, "Pray tell us no more of that, for it is well known what he gave you, and you gave him." To conclude, his soldiers in the Gallic triumph, amongst other verses, such as they jocularly sung on those occasions, following the general's chariot, recited these, which since that time have become extremely common. The Gauls to Caesar yield, Caesar to Nicomede. Lo! Caesar triumphs for his glorious deed. But Caesar's conqueror gains no victor's meed. It is admitted by all that he was much addicted to women, as well as very expensive in his intrigues with them, and that he debauched many ladies of the highest quality, among whom were Posthumia, the wife of Servius Sulpicius, Lollia, the wife of Aulus Gabinius, Titula, the wife of Marcus Crassus, and Mutia, the wife of Gnaeus Pompey. For it is certain that the Curios, both father and son, and many others, made it a reproach to Pompey, that to gratify his ambition, he married the daughter of a man, upon whose account he had divorced his wife, after having had 3 children by her, and whom he used, with a deep sigh, to call Aegis thus. But the mistress he most loved, was Servilia, the mother of Marcus Brutus, for whom he purchased, in his first consulship after the commencement of their intrigue, a pearl which cost him 6 millions of sesterces, and in the civil war, besides other presents, assigned to her, for a trifling consideration, some valuable farms when they were exposed to public auction. Many persons expressing their surprise at the lowness of the price, Cicero wittily remarked, "To let you know the real value of the purchase, between ourselves, Tertia was deducted, for Servilia was supposed to have prostituted her daughter Tertia to Caesar. That he had intrigues likewise with married women in the provinces, appears from this distich, which was as much repeated in the Gallic triumph as the former. Watch well your wives, ye cits, we bring a blade. A bald pate master of the wenching trade. Thy gold was spent on many a Gallic W.E. Exhausted now, thou comest to borrow more." In the number of his mistresses were also some queens, such as Juno, Amor, the wife of Bogudes, to whom and her husband he made, as Naso reports, many large presents. But his greatest favorite was Cleopatra, with whom he often reveled all night until the dawn of day, and would have gone with her through Egypt in dalliance, as far as Ethiopia, in her luxurious yacht, had not the army refused to follow him. He afterwards invited her to Rome, whence he sent her back loaded with honors and presents, and gave her permission to call by his name a son, who, according to the testimony of some Greek historians, resembled Caesar both in person and gait. Mark Antony declared in the Senate, that Caesar had acknowledged the child as his own, and that Caius Matius, Caius Oppius, and the rest of Caesar's friends knew it to be true. On which occasion, Oppius, as if it had been an imputation which he was called upon to refute, published a book to show, that the child which Cleopatra fathered upon Caesar, was not his. Helvius Cinna, tribune of the people, admitted to several persons the fact, that he had a bill ready drawn, which Caesar had ordered him to get enacted in his absence, allowing him, with the hope of leaving issue, to take any wife he chose, and as many of them as he pleased, and to leave no room for doubt of his infamous character for unnatural lewdness and adultery. Curio, the father, says, in one of his speeches, he was every woman's man, and every man's woman. It is acknowledged even by his enemies, that in regard to wine, he was abstemious. A remark is ascribed to Marcus Cato, that Caesar was the only sober man amongst all those who were engaged in the design to subvert the government. In the matter of diet, Caius Oppius informs us, that he was so indifferent, that when a person in whose house he was entertained, had served him with stale, instead of fresh, oil, and the rest of the company would not touch it, he alone ate very heartily of it, that he might not seem to tax the master of the house with rusticity or want of attention. But his abstinence did not extend to pecuniary advantages, either in his military commands, or civil offices, for we have the testimony of some writers, that he took money from the proconsul, who was his predecessor in Spain, and from the Roman allies in that quarter, for the discharge of his debts, and plundered at the point of the sword some towns of the Lusitanians, notwithstanding they attempted no resistance, and opened their gates to him upon his arrival before them. In Gaul, he rifled the chapels and temples of the gods, which were filled with rich offerings, and demolished cities oftener for the sake of their spoil, than for any ill they had done. By this means gold became so plentiful with him, that he exchanged it through Italy and the provinces of the empire for 3,000 sesterces the pound. In his first consulship he purloined from the capital 3,000 pounds weight of gold, and substituted for it the same quantity of gilt brass. He bartered likewise to foreign nations and princes, for gold, the titles of allies and kings, and squeezed out of Ptolemy alone near 6,000 talents, in the name of himself and Pompey. He afterwards supported the expense of the civil wars, and of his triumphs and public spectacles, by the most flagrant rapine and sacrilege. In eloquence and warlike achievements, he equaled at least, if he did not surpass, the greatest of men. After his prosecution of Dolabella, he was indisputably reckoned one of the most distinguished advocates. Cicero, in recounting to Brutus the famous orators, declares that he does not see that Caesar was inferior to any one of them, and says that he had an elegant, splendid, noble, and magnificent vein of eloquence. And in a letter to Cornelius Nepos, he writes of him in the following terms: "What? Of all the orators, who, during the whole course of their lives, have done nothing else, which can you prefer to him? Which of them is more pointed or terse in his periods, or employs more polished and elegant language? In his youth, he seems to have chosen Strabo Caesar for his model, from whose oration in behalf of the Sardinians he has transcribed some passages literally into his divination. In his delivery he is said to have had a shrill voice, and his action was animated, but not ungraceful. He has left behind him some speeches, among which are ranked a few that are not genuine, such as that on behalf of Quintus Metellus. These Augustus supposes, with reason, to be rather the production of blundering shorthand writers, who were not able to keep pace with him in the delivery, than publications of his own. For I find in some copies that the title is not for Metellus, but what he wrote to Metellus, whereas the speech is delivered in the name of Caesar, vindicating Metellus and himself from the aspersions cast upon them by their common defamers. The speech addressed to his soldiers in Spain, Augustus considers likewise as spurious. We meet with two under this title, one made, as is pretended, in the first battle, and the other in the last, at which time, Asinius Pollio says, he had not leisure to address the soldiers, on account of the suddenness of the enemy's attack. He has likewise left commentaries of his own actions both in the war in Gaul, and in the civil war with Pompey, for the author of the Alexandrian, African, and Spanish wars is not known with any certainty. Some think they are the production of Oppius, and some of Hirtius, the latter of whom composed the last book, which is imperfect, of the Gallic War. Of Caesar's commentaries, Cicero, in his Brutus, speaks thus: he wrote his commentaries in a manner deserving of great approbation. They are plain, precise, and elegant, without any affectation of rhetorical ornament. In having thus prepared materials for others who might be inclined to write his history, he may perhaps have encouraged some silly creatures to enter upon such a work, who will needs be dressing up his actions in all the extravagance of bombast, but he has discouraged wise men from ever attempting the subject. Hirtius delivers his opinion of these commentaries in the following terms: so great is the approbation with which they are universally perused, that, instead of rousing, he seems to have precluded the efforts of any future historian. Yet, with respect to this work, we have more reason to admire him than others, for they only know how well and correctly he has written, but we know, likewise, how easily and quickly he did it. Pollio Asinius thinks that they were not drawn up with much care, or with a due regard to truth, for he insinuates that Caesar was too hasty of belief in regard to what was performed by others under his orders, and that he has not given a very faithful account of his own acts, either by design, or through defect of memory, expressing at the same time an opinion that Caesar intended a new and more correct edition. He has left behind him likewise 2 books on analogy, with the same number under the title of Anticato, and a poem entitled The Itinerary. Of these books, he composed the first 2 in his passage over the Alps, as he was returning to the army after making his circuit in Hither Gaul, the second work about the time of the Battle of Munda, and the last during the 24 days he employed in his journey from Rome to Farther Spain. There are extant some letters of his to the Senate, written in a manner never practiced by any before him, for they are distinguished into pages in the form of a memorandum book, whereas the consuls and commanders till then used constantly in their letters to continue the line quite across the sheet, without any folding or distinction of pages. There are extant likewise some letters from him to Cicero, and others to his friends, concerning his domestic affairs, in which, if there was occasion for secrecy, he wrote in ciphers, that is, he used the alphabet in such a manner, that not a single word could be made out. The way to decipher those epistles was to substitute the fourth for the first letter, as D for A, and so for the other letters respectively. Some things likewise pass under his name, said to have been written by him when a boy, or a very young man, as the Encomium of Hercules, a tragedy entitled Oedipus, and a collection of apothegms, all which Augustus forbade to be published, in a short and plain letter to Pompeius Macer, who was employed by him in the arrangement of his libraries. He was perfect in the use of arms, an accomplished rider, and able to endure fatigue beyond all belief. On a march, he used to go at the head of his troops, sometimes on horseback, but oftener on foot, with his head bare in all kinds of weather. He would travel post in a light carriage without baggage, at the rate of 100 miles a day, and if he was stopped by floods in the rivers, he swam across, or floated on skins inflated with wind, so that he often anticipated intelligence of his movements. In his expeditions, it is difficult to say whether his caution or his daring was most conspicuous. He never marched his army by roads which were exposed to ambuscades, without having previously examined the nature of the ground by his scouts. Nor did he cross over to Britain, before he had carefully examined, in person, the navigation, the harbours, and the most convenient point of landing in the island. When intelligence was brought to him of the siege of his camp in Germany, he made his way to his troops, through the enemy's stations, in a Gaulish dress. He crossed the sea from Brundisium and Dyrrhachium, in the winter, through the midst of the enemy's fleets, and the troops, under orders to join him, being slow in their movements, notwithstanding repeated messages to hurry them, but to no purpose, he at last went privately, and alone, aboard a small vessel in the night time, with his head muffled up, nor did he make himself known, or suffer the master to put about, although the wind blew strong against them, until they were ready to sink. He was never deterred from any enterprise, nor retarded in the prosecution of it, by superstition. When a victim, which he was about to offer in sacrifice, made its escape, he did not therefore defer his expedition against Scipio and Juba. And happening to fall, upon stepping out of the ship, he gave a lucky turn to the omen, by exclaiming, "I hold thee fast, Africa," to chide the prophecies which were spread abroad, that the name of the Scipios was, by the decrees of fate, fortunate and invincible in that province. He retained in the camp a profligate wretch, of the family of the Cornelii, who, on account of his scandalous life, was surnamed Seleucio. He not only fought pitched battles, but made sudden attacks when an opportunity offered, often at the end of a march, and sometimes during the most violent storms, when nobody could imagine he would stir. Nor was he ever backward in fighting, until towards the end of his life. He then was of opinion, that the oftener he had been crowned with success, the less he ought to expose himself to new hazards, and that nothing he could gain by a victory would compensate for what he might lose by a miscarriage. He never defeated the enemy without driving them from their camp, and giving them no time to rally their forces. When the issue of a battle was doubtful, he sent away all the horses, and his own first, that having no means of flight, they might be under the greater necessity of standing their ground. He rode a very remarkable horse, with feet almost like those of a man, the hoofs being divided in such a manner as to have some resemblance to toes. This horse he had bred himself, and the soothsayers having interpreted these circumstances into an omen that its owner would be master of the world, he brought him up with particular care, and broke him in himself, as the horse would suffer no one else to mount him. A statue of this horse was afterwards erected by Caesar's order before the temple of Venus Genetrix. He often rallied his troops, when they were giving way, by his personal efforts, stopping those who fled, keeping others in their ranks, and seizing them by their throat turned them towards the enemy, although numbers were so terrified that an eagle-bearer, thus stopped, made a thrust at him with the spearhead, and another, upon a similar occasion, left the standard in his hand. The following instances of his resolution are equally, and even more remarkable. After the Battle of Pharsalia, having sent his troops before him into Asia, as he was passing the straits of the Hellespont in a ferryboat, he met with Lucius Cassius, one of the opposite party, with 10 ships of war, and so far from endeavoring to escape, he went alongside his ship, and calling upon him to surrender, Cassius humbly gave him his submission. At Alexandria, in the attack of a bridge, being forced by a sudden sally of the enemy into a boat, and several others hurrying in with him, he leaped into the sea, and saved himself by swimming to the next ship, which lay at the distance of 200 paces, holding up his left hand out of the water, for fear of wetting some papers which he held in it, and pulling his general's cloak after him with his teeth, lest it should fall into the hands of the enemy. He never valued a soldier for his moral conduct or his means, but for his courage only, and treated his troops with a mixture of severity and indulgence, for he did not always keep a strict hand over them, but only when the enemy was near. Then indeed he was so strict a disciplinarian, that he would give no notice of a march or a battle until the moment of action, in order that the troops might hold themselves in readiness for any sudden movement, and he would frequently draw them out of the camp without any necessity for it, especially in rainy weather, and upon holidays. Sometimes, giving them orders not to lose sight of him, he would suddenly depart by day or by night, and lengthen the marches in order to tire them out, as they followed him at a distance. When at any time his troops were dispirited by reports of the great force of the enemy, he rallied their courage, not by denying the truth of what was said, or by diminishing the facts, but, on the contrary, by exaggerating every particular. Accordingly, when his troops were in great alarm at the expected arrival of King Juba, he called them together, and said, "I have to inform you that in a very few days the king will be here, with 10 legions, 30,000 horse, 100,000 light-armed foot, and 300 elephants. Let none of you, therefore, presume to make further inquiry, or indulge in conjectures, but take my word for what I tell you, which I have from undoubted intelligence, otherwise I shall put them aboard an old crazy vessel, and leave them exposed to the mercy of the winds, to be transported to some other country." He neither noticed all their transgressions, nor punished them according to strict rule. But for deserters and mutineers he made the most diligent inquiry, and their punishment was most severe. Other delinquencies he would connive at. Sometimes, after a great battle ending in victory, he would grant them a relaxation from all kinds of duty, and leave them to revel at pleasure, being used to boast that his soldiers fought nothing the worse for being well oiled. In his speeches, he never addressed them by the title of soldiers, but by the kind of phrase of fellow soldiers, and kept them in such splendid order, that their arms were ornamented with silver and gold, not merely for parade, but to render the soldiers more resolute to save them in battle, and fearful of losing them. He loved his troops to such a degree, that when he heard of the defeat of those under Titurius, he neither cut his hair nor shaved his beard, until he had revenged it upon the enemy, by which means he engaged their devoted affection, and raised their valor to the highest pitch. Upon his entering on the civil war, the centurions of every legion offered, each of them, to maintain a horseman at his own expense, and the whole army agreed to serve gratis, without either corn or pay, those amongst them who were rich, charging themselves with the maintenance of the poor. No one of them, during the whole course of the war, deserted to the enemy, and many of those who were made prisoners, though they were offered their lives, upon condition of bearing arms against him, refused to accept the terms. They endured want, and other hardships, not only when they were besieged themselves, but when they besieged others, to such a degree, that Pompey, when blocked up in the neighborhood of Dyrrachium, upon seeing a sort of bread made of an herb, which they lived upon, said, "I have to do with wild beasts," and ordered it immediately to be taken away, because, if his troops should see it, their spirit might be broken by perceiving the endurance and determined resolution of the enemy. With what bravery they fought, one instance affords sufficient proof, which is, that after an unsuccessful engagement at Dyrrhachium, they called for punishment, insomuch that their general found it more necessary to comfort than to punish them. In other battles, in different quarters, they defeated with ease immense armies of the enemy, although they were much inferior to them in number. In short, one cohort of the 6th Legion held out a fort against 4 legions belonging to Pompey, during several hours, being almost every one of them wounded by the vast number of arrows discharged against them, and of which there were found within the ramparts 130,000. This is no way surprising, when we consider the conduct of some individuals amongst them, such as that of Cassius Sceva, a centurion, or Caius Acilius, a common soldier, not to speak of others. Sceva, after having an eye struck out, being run through the thigh and the shoulder, and having his shield pierced in 120 places, maintained obstinately the guard of the gate of a fort, with the command of which he was entrusted. Acilius, in the sea fight at Marseilles, having seized a ship of the enemy's with his right hand, and that being cut off, in imitation of that memorable instance of resolution in Cynaegirus amongst the Greeks, boarded the enemy's ship, bearing down all before him with the boss of his shield. They never once mutinied during all the 10 years of the Gallic War, but were sometimes refractory in the course of the Civil War. However, they always returned quickly to their duty, and that not through the indulgence, but in submission to the authority, of their general, for he never yielded to them when they were insubordinate, but constantly resisted their demands. He disbanded the whole 9th Legion with ignominy at Placentia, although Pompey was still in arms, and would not receive them again into his service, until they had not only made repeated and humble entreaties, but until the ringleaders in the mutiny were punished. When the soldiers of the 10th Legion at Rome demanded their discharge and rewards for their service, with violent threats and no small danger to the city, although the war was then raging in Africa, he did not hesitate, contrary to the advice of his friends, to meet the legion, and disband it. But addressing them by the title of Quirites, instead of soldiers, he by this single word so thoroughly brought them round and changed their determination, that they immediately cried out, they were his soldiers, and followed him to Africa, although he had refused their service. He nevertheless punished the most mutinous among them, with the loss of 1/3 of their share in the plunder, and the land destined for them. In the service of his clients, while yet a young man, he evinced great zeal and fidelity. He defended the cause of a noble youth, Macintha, against King Hyempsal, so strenuously, that in a scuffle which took place upon the occasion, he seized by the beard the son of King Juba, and upon Macintha's being declared tributary to Hyempsal, while the friends of the adverse party were violently carrying him off, he immediately rescued him by force, kept him concealed in his house a long time, and when, at the expiration of his praetorship, he went to Spain, he took him away in his litter. In the midst of his lictors bearing the fasces, and others who had come to attend and take leave of him. He always treated his friends with such kindness and good nature, that when Caius Oppius, in travelling with him through a forest, was suddenly taken ill, he resigned to him the only place there was to shelter them at night, and lay upon the ground in the open air. When he had placed himself at the head of affairs, he advanced some of his faithful adherents, though of mean extraction, to the highest offices, and when he was censured for this partiality, he openly said, "Had I been assisted by robbers and cutthroats in the defense of my honor, I should have made them the same recompense." The resentment he entertained against anyone was never so implacable that he did not very willingly renounce it when opportunity offered. Although Caius Memmius had published some extremely virulent speeches against him, and he had answered him with equal acrimony, yet he afterwards assisted him with his vote and interest, when he stood candidate for the consulship. When C. Calvus, after publishing some scandalous epigrams upon him, endeavored to effect a reconciliation by the intercession of friends, he wrote to him, of his own accord, the first letter. And when Valerius Catullus, who had, as he himself observed, fixed such a stain upon his character in his verses upon Mamurra as never could be obliterated, he begged his pardon, invited him to supper the same day, and continued to take up his lodging with his father occasionally, as he had been accustomed to do. His temper was also naturally averse to severity in retaliation. After he had captured the pirates, by whom he had been taken, having sworn that he would crucify them, he did so indeed, but he first ordered their throats to be cut. He could never bear the thought of doing any harm to Cornelius Vigites, who had dogged him in the night when he was sick and a fugitive, with the design of carrying him to Sylla, and from whose hands he had escaped with some difficulty by giving him a bribe. Philemon, his amanuensis, who had promised his enemies to poison him, he put to death without torture. When he was summoned as a witness against Publicus Clodius, his wife Pompeia's gallant, who was prosecuted for the profanation of religious ceremonies, he declared he knew nothing of the affair, although his mother Aurelia, and his sister Julia, gave the court an exact and full account of the circumstances. And being asked why then he had divorced his wife, "Because," he said, "my family should not only be free from guilt, but even from the suspicion of it." Both in his administration and his conduct towards the vanquished party in the civil war, he showed a wonderful moderation and clemency. For while Pompey declared that he would consider those as enemies who did not take arms in defense of the Republic, he desired it to be understood that he should regard those who remained neuter as his friends. With regard to all those to whom he had, on Pompey's recommendation, given any command in the army, he left them at perfect liberty to go over to him, if they pleased. When some proposals were made at Illyria for a surrender, which gave rise to a free communication between the two camps, and Afranius and Petreius, upon a sudden change of resolution, had put to the sword all Caesar's men who were found in the camp, he scorned to imitate the base treachery which they had practiced against himself. On the field of Pharsalia, he called out to the soldiers to spare their fellow citizens, and afterwards gave permission to every man in his army to save an enemy. None of them, so far as appears, lost their lives but in battle, excepting only Afranius, Faustus, and young Lucius Caesar, and it is thought that even they were put to death without his consent. Afranius and Faustus had borne arms against him, after obtaining their pardon, and Lucius Caesar had not only in the most cruel manner destroyed with fire and sword his freedmen and slaves, but cut to pieces the wild beasts which he had prepared for the entertainment of the people. And finally, a little before his death, he permitted all whom he had not before pardoned, to return into Italy, and to bear offices both civil and military. He even replaced the statues of Sylla and Pompey, which had been thrown down by the populace. And after this, whatever was devised or uttered, he chose rather to check than to punish it. Accordingly, having detected certain conspiracies and nocturnal assemblies, he went no farther than to intimate by a proclamation that he knew of them, and as to those who indulged themselves in the liberty of reflecting severely upon him, he only warned them in a public speech not to persist in their offense. He bore with great moderation a virulent libel written against him by Aulus Caecina, and the abusive lampoons of Pythalos, most highly reflecting on his reputation. His other words and actions, however, so far outweigh all his good qualities, that it is thought he abused his power, and was justly cut off. For he not only obtained excessive honors, such as the consulship every year, the dictatorship for life, and the censorship, but also the title of emperor, and the surname of father of his country, besides having his statue amongst the kings, and a lofty couch in the theatre. He even suffered some honors to be decreed to him, which were unbefitting the most exalted of mankind, such as a gilded chair of state in the Senate House and on his tribunal, a consecrated chariot, and banners in the Circensian procession, temples, altars, statues among the gods, a bed of state in the temples, a priest, and a college of priests dedicated to himself, like those of Pan, and that one of the months should be called by his name. There were, indeed, no honors which he did not either assume himself, or grant to others, at his will and pleasure. In his third and fourth consulship, he used only the title of the office, being content with the power of dictator, which was conferred upon him with the consulship, and in both years he substituted other consuls in his room, during the 3 last months, so that in the intervals he held no assemblies of the people, for the election of magistrates, excepting only tribunes and aediles of the people, and appointed officers, under the name of prefects, instead of the praetors, to administer the affairs of the city during his absence. The office of consul having become vacant, by the sudden death of one of the consuls the day before the calends of January, the St. January, he conferred it on a person who requested it of him, for a few hours. Assuming the same license, and regardless of the customs of his country, he appointed magistrates to hold their offices for terms of years. He granted the insignia of the consular dignity to 10 persons of praetorian rank. He admitted into the Senate some men who had been made free of the city, and even natives of Gaul, who were semi-barbarians. He likewise appointed to the management of the mint, and the public revenue of the state, some servants of his own household, and entrusted the command of 3 legions, which he left at Alexandria, to an old catamite of his, the son of his freedman Rufinus. He was guilty of the same extravagance in the language he publicly used, as Titus Ampius informs us, according to whom he said, "The Republic is nothing but a name, without substance or reality." Sylla was an ignorant fellow to abdicate the dictatorship. Men ought to consider what is becoming when they talk with me, and look upon what I say as a law. To such a pitch of arrogance did he proceed, that when a soothsayer announced to him the unfavorable omen, that the entrails of a victim offered for sacrifice were without a heart, he said, "The entrails will be more favorable when I please, and it ought not to be regarded as a prodigy that a beast should be found wanting a heart." But what brought upon him the greatest odium, and was thought an unpardonable insult, was his receiving the whole body of the conscript fathers sitting before the temple of Venus Genetrix, when they waited upon him with a number of decrees, conferring on him the highest dignities. Some say that, on his attempting to rise, he was held down by Cornelius Balbus, others, that he did not attempt to rise at all, but frowned on Caius Trebatius, who suggested to him that he should stand up to receive the Senate. This behavior appeared the more intolerable in him, because, when one of the tribunes of the people, Pontius Aquila, would not rise up to him, as he passed by the tribune's seat during his triumph, he was so much offended, that he cried out, "Well then, you tribune, Aquila, oust me from the government." And for some days afterwards, he never promised a favor to any person, without this proviso, "If Pontius Aquila will give me leave." To this extraordinary mark of contempt for the Senate, he added another affront still more outrageous. For when, after the sacred rites of the Latin festival, he was returning home, amidst the immoderate and unusual acclamations of the people, a man in the crowd put a laurel crown, encircled with a white fillet, on one of his statues, upon which, the tribunes of the people, Epidius Morallus, and Cececius Flavus, ordered the fillet to be removed from the crown, and the man to be taken to prison. Caesar, being much concerned either that the idea of royalty had been suggested to so little purpose, or, as was said, that he was thus deprived of the merit of refusing it, reprimanded the tribunes very severely, and dismissed them from their office. From that day forward, he was never able to wipe off the scandal of affecting the name of king, although he replied to the populace, when they saluted him by that title, "I am Caesar, and no king." And at the feast of the Lupercalia, when the consul Antony placed a crown upon his head in the rostra several times, he has often put it away, and sent it to the Capitol for Jupiter, the best and the greatest. A report was very current, that he had a design of withdrawing to Alexandria or Ilium, whither he proposed to transfer the imperial power, to drain Italy by new levies, and to leave the government of the city to be administered by his friends. To this report it was added, that in the next meeting of the Senate, Lucius Cotta, one of the 15, would make a motion, that as there was in the Sibylline books a prophecy, that the Parthians would never be subdued but by a king, Caesar should have that title conferred upon him. For this reason the conspirators precipitated the execution of their design, that they might not be obliged to give their assent to the proposal. Instead, therefore, of caballing any longer separately, in small parties, they now united their councils, the people themselves being dissatisfied with the present state of affairs, both privately and publicly condemning the tyranny under which they lived, and calling on patriots to assert their cause against the usurper. Upon the admission of foreigners into the Senate, a handbill was posted up in these words, "A good deed." Let no one show a new senator the way to the house. These verses were likewise currently repeated. The Gauls he dragged in triumph through the town. Caesar has brought into the Senate house and changed their plaids for the patrician gown. Gallos Caesar in triumphum jucit, idem in curiam. Golli brachas depursuant, latum clavum sumpserunt. When Quintus Maximus, who had been his deputy in the consulship for the last 3 months, entered the theatre, and the lictor, according to custom, bid the people take notice who was coming, they all cried out, "He is no consul." After the removal of Cececius and Marullus from their office, they were found to have a great many votes at the next election of consuls. Someone wrote under the statue of Lucius Brutus, "Would you were now alive," and under the statue of Caesar himself these lines. Because he drove from Rome the royal race. Brutus was first made consul in their place. This man, because he put the consuls down, has been rewarded with a royal crown. Brutus, quia regs egessit, consul primus factus est. Hic, quia consuls egessit, rex post remo factus est. About 60 persons were engaged in the conspiracy against him, of whom Caius Cassius, and Marcus and Decimus Brutus were the chief. It was at first debated amongst them, whether they should attack him in the Campus Martius when he was taking the votes of the tribes, and some of them should throw him off the bridge, whilst others should be ready to stab him upon his fall, or else in the Via Sacra, or at the entrance of the theatre. But after public notice had been given by proclamation for the Senate to assemble upon the Ides of March, March, in the Senate house built by Pompey, they approved both of the time and place, as most fitting for their purpose. Caesar had warning given him of his fate by indubitable omens. A few months before, when the colonists settled at Capua, by virtue of the Julian law, were demolishing some old sepulchres, in building country houses, and were the more eager at the work, because they discovered certain vessels of antique workmanship, a tablet of brass was found in a tomb, in which Capys, the founder of Capua, was said to have been buried, with an inscription in the Greek language to this effect: "Whenever the bones of Capys come to be discovered, a descendant of Iulus will be slain by the hands of his kinsmen, and his death revenged by fearful disasters throughout Italy." Lest any person should regard this anecdote as a fabulous or silly invention, it was circulated upon the authority of Caius Balbus, an intimate friend of Caesar's. A few days likewise before his death, he was informed that the horses, which, upon his crossing the Rubicon, he had consecrated, and turned loose to graze without a keeper, abstained entirely from eating, and shed floods of tears. The soothsayer Spurina, observing certain ominous appearances in a sacrifice which he was offering, advised him to beware of some danger, which threatened to befall him before the Ides of March were past. The day before the Ides, birds of various kinds from a neighboring grove, pursuing a wren which flew into Pompey's Senate house, with a sprig of laurel in its beak, tore it in pieces. Also, in the night on which the day of his, when he had taken his seat, the conspirators stood round him, under colour of paying their compliments, and immediately Tullius Cimber, who had engaged to commence the assault, advancing nearer than the rest, as if he had some favour to request, Caesar made signs that he should defer his petition to some other time. Tullius immediately seized him by the toga, on both shoulders, at which Caesar crying out, "Violence is meant," one of the Cassii wounded him a little below the throat. Caesar seized him by the arm, and ran it through with his style, and endeavouring to rush forward was stopped by another wound. Finding himself now attacked on all hands with naked poniards, he wrapped the toga about his head, and at the same moment drew the skirt round his legs with his left hand, that he might fall more decently with the lower part of his body covered. He was stabbed with 23 wounds, uttering a groan only, but no cry, at the first wound, although some authors relate, that when Marcus Brutus fell upon him, he exclaimed, "What? Art thou, too, one of them? Thou, my son?" The whole assembly instantly dispersing, he lay for some time after he expired, until 3 of his slaves laid the body on a litter, and carried it home, with one arm hanging down over the side. Among so many wounds, there was none that was mortal, in the opinion of the surgeon Antistius, except the second, which he received in the breast. The conspirators meant to drag his body into the Tiber as soon as they had killed him, to confiscate his estate, and rescind all his enactments, but they were deterred by fear of Mark Antony, and Lepidus, Caesar's master of the horse, and abandoned their intentions. At the instance of Lucius Piso, his father-in-law, his will was opened and read in Mark Antony's house. He had made it on the Ides, th, of the preceding September, at his Lavican villa, and committed it to the custody of the chief of the Vestal Virgins. Quintus Tubero informs us, that in all the wills he had signed, from the time of his first consulship to the breaking out of the civil war, Gnaeus Pompey was appointed his heir, and that this had been publicly notified to the army. But in his last will, he named 3 heirs, the grandsons of his sisters, namely, Caius Octavius for 3/4 of his estate, and Lucius Pinarius and Quintus Pedius for the remaining 4th. Other heirs, in remainder, were named at the close of the will, in which he also adopted Caius Octavius, who was to assume his name, into his family, and nominated most of those who were concerned in his death among the guardians of his son, if he should have any, as well as Decimus Brutus amongst his heirs of the 2nd order. Be bequeathed to the Roman people his gardens near the Tiber, and 300 sesterces each man. Notice of his funeral having been solemnly proclaimed, a pile was erected in the Campus Martius, near the tomb of his daughter Julia, and before the rostra was placed a gilded tabernacle, on the model of the temple of Venus Genetrix, within which was an ivory bed, covered with purple and cloth of gold. At the head was a trophy, with the blood-stained robe in which he was slain. It being considered that the whole day would not suffice for carrying the funeral oblations in solemn procession before the corpse, directions were given for every one, without regard to order, to carry them from the city into the Campus Martius, by what way they pleased. To raise pity and indignation for his murder, in the plays acted at the funeral, a passage was sung from Pacuvius's tragedy, entitled, The Trial for Arms. That ever I, unhappy man, should save wretches, who thus have brought me to the grave. And some lines also from Attilius's tragedy of Electra, to the same effect. Instead of a funeral panegyric, the consul Antony ordered a herald to proclaim to the people the decree of the Senate, in which they had bestowed upon him all honors, divine and human, with the oath by which they had engaged themselves for the defense of his person, and to these he added only a few words of his own. The magistrates and others who had formerly filled the highest offices, carried the bier from the rostra into the forum. While some proposed that the body should be burnt in the sanctuary of the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, and others in Pompey's Senate house, on a sudden, 2 men, with swords by their sides, and spears in their hands, set fire to the bier with lighted torches. The throng around immediately heaped upon it dry faggots, the tribunals and benches of the adjoining courts, and whatever else came to hand. Then the musicians and players stripped off the dresses they wore on the present occasion, taken from the wardrobe of his triumphant spectacles, rent them, and threw them into the flames. The legionaries, also, of his veteran bands, cast in their armor, which they had put on in honor of his funeral. Most of the ladies did the same by their ornaments, with the bully, and mantles of their children. In this public mourning there joined a multitude of foreigners, expressing their sorrow according to the fashion of their respective countries, but especially the Jews, who for several nights together frequented the spot where the body was burnt. The populace ran from the funeral, with torches in their hands, to the houses of Brutus and Cassius, and were repelled with difficulty. Going in quest of Cornelius Cinna, who had in a speech, the day before, reflected severely upon Caesar, and mistaking for him Helvius Cinna, who happened to fall into their hands, they murdered the latter, and carried his head about the city on the point of a spear. They afterwards erected in the forum a column of Numidian marble, formed of one stone nearly 20 feet high, and inscribed upon it these words, "To the father of his country." At this column they continued for a long time to offer sacrifices, make vows, and decide controversies, in which they swore by Caesar. Some of Caesar's friends entertained a suspicion that he neither desired nor cared to live any longer, on account of his declining health, and for that reason slighted all the omens of religion, and the warnings of his friends. Others are of opinion, that thinking himself secure in the late decree of the Senate, and their oaths, he dismissed his Spanish guards who attended him with drawn swords. Others again suppose, that he chose rather to face at once the dangers which threatened him on all sides, than to be forever on the watch against them. Some tell us that he used to say, the Commonwealth was more interested in the safety of his person than himself, for that he had for some time been satiated with power and glory, but that the Commonwealth, if anything should befall him, would have no rest, and, involved in another civil war, would be in a worse state than before. This, however, was generally admitted, that his death was in many respects such as he would have chosen. For, upon reading the account delivered by Xenophon, how Cyrus in his last illness gave instructions respecting his funeral, Caesar deprecated a lingering death, and wished that his own might be sudden and speedy. And the day before he died, the conversation at supper, in the house of Marcus Lepidus, turning upon what was the most eligible way of dying, he gave his opinion in favor of a death that is sudden and unexpected. He died in the 56th year of his age, and was ranked amongst the gods, not only by a formal decree, but in the belief of the vulgar. For during the first games which Augustus, his heir, consecrated to his memory, a comet blazed for 7 days together, rising always about 11 o'clock, and it was supposed to be the soul of Caesar, now received into heaven, for which reason, likewise, he is represented on his statue with a star on his brow. The Senate house in which he was slain, was ordered to be shut up, and a decree made that the Ides of March should be called parricidal, and the Senate should never more assemble on that day. Scarcely any of those who were accessory to his murder, survived him more than 3 years, or died a natural death. They were all condemned by the Senate, some were taken off by one accident, some by another. Part of them perished at sea, others fell in battle, and some slew themselves with the same poniard with which they had stabbed Caesar. Thank you for watching.
If you are returning to the Classic Masterworks channel, welcome back. If you are new, please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you will be made aware of our latest content.